So you have a book that's it's coming out next month
Tuesday.
on Tuesday. Congratulations
Thank
to
you
you.
very much. I
Wonderful.
appreciate that.
And it's called The Secret Life of Mob Boss Ralph Natale. Hope I got the last name correct.
You did.
Good so far.
Yeah.
Okay. The Last Don Standing by Larry McShane and Dan Pearson. What is this interest that you've had writing very exciting, interesting types of books about organized crime? Is it something that you reported on early on, obviously, for the paper?
I started working in the city in 1980, and then kind of the mid 80s into the 90s was I don't want to say the heyday of the mob, but it was the heyday of Vincent Gigante and John Gotti, Sammy the Bull Gravano, a lot of real colorful figures who made a lot of news, all wound up going to jail pretty much. But so yeah, there was a lot of interest, a lot of big trials. Rudy Giuliani was the Manhattan prosecutor, federal prosecutor. He was bringing cases. So it's just something that I took an interest in. God, I hate to say it, like 30 years ago now.
Hey, time flies, right?
Yeah.
So Ralph Natale, was this the first actual interview that you had with a very prominent, a very big mob boss?
Yeah, he's definitely the highest up the food chain, no question.
And you sat with him several times and you spoke with him.
Yeah, we had an arrangement where I would drive to meet him, and it was just me and him sitting at a table. I would bring my tape recorder, and we'd talk for 2-3 hours. He's kind of an older guy. He just turned 82 this month. So Ralph and I would just talk until we both felt like we were kind of finished for the day.
Right.
And then I'd come back the next Monday and.
But he was very honest about when you asked him a question, he would answer all of your questions, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so, no matter what you asked him. And he also, for a guy his age, has an incredible recall of details and dates. He also, while he was in prison, he had done a 16-year prison term.
For drugs, right?
Drugs and arson. He had started handwriting, printing on legal pads, kind of a history of the Philadelphia mob in his own life. So at a certain point after we had spoken, I had access to all these legal pads with all his things. And he became, while he was in prison, almost like a historian of the Philadelphia mob. He told me that he would seek out guys coming into prison who could fill him in as to what was going on back home and what was going on elsewhere around the country. And so he was able to kind of connect a lot of dots that way. Ralph said basically the union was Hoffa's whole life. He had no vices like a lot of guys might have in that position, gambling or drugs or booze or women. His whole thing was the Teamsters. And so they met at a bar in Cherry Hill, Ralph and Jimmy. And Hoffa was kind of testing the waters to see if he could get any backing certain factions of the mob to return to his old post. And Ralph basically had to tell him that this wasn't going to happen, that the Philadelphia mob wasn't going to back his play. And Ralph had a great line where he said, when he was talking to him, he could smell the dirt of the grave on him. And then a few weeks later, Hoffa disappeared. And, yeah, so.
And Ralph Natale, what would you say his general demeanor was when you met him? I mean, we just said before he was friendly, he was to the point, he was honest with you, he answered your questions. Anything else you could share about his personality, or how his personality would differ, let's say, from somebody maybe that you didn't meet? I mean, even though it may...
I'll give you a funny story. The first time I went down to meet him, he tells me a story about this Christmas night. He takes this union guy who's been giving him trouble out, and he sits in the back seat. This guy's in the front seat. He shoots him, in the head 3 times from behind him. This is like the first time we met, So, okay, and he tells it in great detail. So I come back up to North Jersey, and I end up having problems with one of the tires on my car. So I call him up the next Sunday. I'm supposed to meet him on Monday. And I said, Ralph, I'm not going to be able to make it down. I got to take my car into the shop. I got a problem with the tire. And he called my agent and said, "I knew he'd never be back."
And was there something else you'd like to tell us about his relationship with Sonny Liston, or being involved with sports betting or with boxing,
Yeah,
numbers?
Ralph had a guy who was kind of his mentor, John DiTullio, who was known as the Skinny Razor because that was his weapon of choice, which he kept in his suit pocket. And they were sitting at DiTullio's bar in Philadelphia one night, and he told him the whole story of Sonny Liston and the mob. So this is Ralph's version of that. Liston, by the time he had become heavyweight champion, was reputedly a heavy heroin user. And he was in the control of the mob. Blinky Palermo, who's a Philadelphia guy, and Frankie Carbo, who's a New York guy, kind of ran the boxing industry at that point. And Sonny Liston was one of their guys. And in part because of his heroin use, they were kind of afraid that he might OD.
Mm.
And then, of course, they would lose their source of income. So the decision was made that when he fought Ali down in Miami, that Liston would throw the fight. And honestly, that was when Ali was in his corner. They wiped his face, something got in his eyes, he was blinded, and he almost never came out of his corner, which would have ruined everything.
And then you wrote about Floyd Patterson.
Yeah, but Liston took his, Ralphie says, Liston took the dive, the mob cashed in, and then, rinse, wash, repeat. They did the same thing for the rematch in Lewiston, Maine. And Ralph says that, they specifically put the fight up in Lewiston, Maine, so it would be, back then there's not the media coverage there is now. So it'd be sort of a little out of sight from everybody, and that's the famous Phantom Punch where Liston went down. So
he was quite different in a sense, different than obviously than Vincent Gigante and John Gotti,
right,
and some of the others. Was there one particular characteristic that would make him stand out, being differently in terms of his personality than those other people that you interviewed?
Well, the two guys you mentioned, Gigante and Gotti, were very much like Ralph, at least initially, in that they were real old school true believers. Ralph served 16 years in prison because he wouldn't give up the people who were involved in the Atlantic City takeover, which involved Anthony Accardo in Chicago, Gambino family here in New York, and the Philadelphia family. There's a piece in the book about where he's called to testify before a congressional subcommittee, and they basically tell him, if you'll give us what we want, we'll let you walk. And he went toe-to-toe with the senators and never gave an inch and never gave up a name, which, I mean, it really, at any point during those 16 years, he could have approached them and said, I'm willing to talk, and he just refused to do it. He did his time.